You know when you get off the ghost train and look back at the structure you've been in, imagining it to be huge to contain all those spooky faces, and it's the size of a triple garage. That's the illusion to create if you have a smallish garden with not much in it, perhaps a bit of lawn and some leylandii. Obviously there are hundreds of ways of doing this. I'll just summarise what I did. Our garden is a corner plot on a housing estate in Somerset, which 5 years ago was a lawn, a poplar tree and 2 old apple trees, with ground at the back and side of the house. First of all, divide the garden into, say, 3 areas separated by eventually tall planting and trellis fencing for climbers. The object is to make sure everything is not visible at once, so there's an element of secrecy and surprise. Use a mix of evergreen and deciduous planting to make sure there is a year-round screen between areas. For instance, I've used cordyline palms with Rosa rugosa, both extremely fast-growing and the latter amazingly scented, to give a bit of colour. Use plants that flower successively, close to each other, to ensure continuous interest. Secondly, I chose to divide things into A, cottage garden with sitting out area next to the house with parasols with the usual herbaceous border. Sufficient sized lawn for overnight visitors' tent. Plant your spice garden close to the house to ensure frequent use. B, mini allotment with lean-to greenhouse to save space, facing east to minimise excessive heat gain, bearing in mind climate change. Protected from prevailing southwest winds. C, jungle, approached via a rose arch, again motivated by climate change, with tiny pond and waterfall, banana palm, apricot, figs, vines, hibiscus and trumpet vine. Lots of yellow pond plants and pot plants surrounding it. Install a decent waterfall or fountain. If in the right place, a substantial splash of water can sometimes reduce traffic noise from a nearby road. The apricot has only produced 1 fruit so far, but we get fresh grape juice in late summer. Big news this year is that one of the fig trees has produced 85 figs. We like them with honey, lightly roasted in the oven. Don't be discouraged if trees don't fruit. One of our plum trees had 1 plum last year. This year, so many that one of the branches split and had to be propped. A local farmer reckons you get a good fruit crop 1 year in 4. Fun to experiment with Mediterranean plants. Not without risk, as I've lost several, as I couldn't be bothered to overwinter them in the greenhouse. I've got some cannas and gingers in a plastic trough, which I painfully manage to drag to the greenhouse each autumn. And that's enough. The main planting theme is to use a variety of fruit and vegetables that suit the local soil, but not to the exclusion of everything else. I've got fertile clay to which I've added bagged farmyard manure from the garden centre. Not cheap, but brings results. You'll hardly be self-sufficient, but it's just great to have a taste of almost organic produce on the table within minutes. I have to admit to selective use of slug death to protect, for instance, sunflower, hollyhock and French bean seedlings, which they love. Above all, cram in as much as possible, including bringing on the next crop in the greenhouse to replace the one you've just removed. Apart from bean plants, of course, which you're supposed to leave in the soil as they fix nitrogen. I always have trouble getting climbing French beans to germinate outside. Don't bother with stuff that fails year after year. I can't grow carrots, cabbages or cauliflowers, for instance, mainly because the 2 latter are usually eaten by caterpillars. I'll have to heed my brother's advice and buy some micro-mesh netting. Any flowering plants should be scented wherever possible. As space is limited, use plants which grow mainly upwards rather than outwards. I've planted fruit trees at about 3-foot centres along the main boundary to create a pleasing outlook and something to eat. This is of course far too close, but ultimately could result in a sort of fruit hedge. If there is a bit of an overlooking problem at points, use individual quick-growing cherry laurel bushes to provide a screen. If overlooking is a real problem, and even if it isn't, consider attaching diamond trellis fencing to the top of your existing fence to encourage scented climbing plants like honeysuckle and the evergreen Clematis armandii. The latter has a prodigious growth rate and flowers early in the season when not much else is out. Continuing the theme of verticality, plant mange tout peas with a climbing net, climbing French beans, broad beans and raspberries, a mixture of summer and autumn fruiting to keep a continuous supply. To economise on space, plant the latter where you can use the 4 feet or so between the rows as part of a path from A to B in the garden. Pave with stepping stones to avoid the tedious levelling problems sometimes encountered with paving stones. Use this area to run the hosepipe through. Plant tall flower species like hollyhock and sunflowers. The former are hard to establish but will reliably come up year after year. Particular success this year with boysenberries, a cross between raspberry and blackberry. 2-year-old plants have grown into substantial bushes against a fence with a great crop in June and July. I get told off by my wife for not weeding properly, but she is the daughter of a market gardener. I plead disability with my knees ruined by five-a-side football. Some people advocate leaving weeds, but the only trouble with that is that they obliterate the seeds you've planted, and if you've got a memory like mine, you forget all about them. I get a lot of self-seeded ash trees, which I always feel sorry for, and try and keep them, at least while they're small, if they're sheltering a fruit tree, for instance. I've used one of them as a climbing frame for a Jingle Bells clematis, which, surprise surprise, flowers at Christmas. I've coppiced another ash to produce a prop for the overloaded plum tree. I spare purple poppies and foxgloves, which pop up in the wrong place but attract bees. Pruning is so important if your theme is to cram in as much as possible. Recently, in pruning some young apple trees, I discovered some loganberry bushes recently planted but forgotten about with unusable overripe fruit. Quelle horreur. However, one of the benefits of overplanting is that you've often got a plant or shrub waiting to take over when another one dies. And of course, the more space occupied by plants and shrubs, the less space for the weeds. Another space economiser is growing first early potatoes in dumpy bags on a spare bit of hard surface in a mixture of soil and farmyard manure. Not much of a return, but great to taste in early June. Also, don't put hanging baskets in hard to see positions, as you'll forget to water them. We've got 4 water butts, 2 off the main roof, 1 off the garage and 1 off the conservatory. If I remember, I'll half empty them onto the garden in advance of any forecasted substantial rain. We use grey water on the garden from the shower and washing up. One advantage of not having a dishwasher. Use boiling water to get rid of pathweeds. Don't use weed killer, especially on lawns, as you can't easily compost the mowings. You can never have enough compost, as the saying goes. I've only once managed to produce a result worth displaying, but my usual claggy mess seems to do the job. Garden furniture, we found the cafe-type aluminium round table and chairs longer lasting than the usual plastic types, which tend to get grubby over time. To avoid the garden being boring for kids, try and include a mini games area. We can just squeeze in a table tennis table, although adjoining plants get trodden on. Finally, if you're of advanced age like me and have an undeveloped garden and some spare money to buy some plants, do it now. Of course, the real reason for doing this is to have somewhere a bit different to have a coffee. Even better on a summer's night, in the jungle, lit by spotlights, installed by the previous owners, to have a beer or two. As the saying goes, sometimes I sits and thinks, and sometimes I just sits.